The first snow of Montana's winter fell early that year, drifting from a steel-gray sky like whispered promises. By sunset, the flakes had grown fat and insistent, carrying on their backs the threat of a season determined to arrive before its time. Night descended with a bitter wind that cut across the open plains, howling its hunger for warmth, for life. Rebecca Hayes ran. Her boots crunched through the fresh powder, each labored breath, forming clouds that dissolved into the darkness. The wound on her arm throbbed in rhythm with her pounding heart blood seeping through the hastily wrapped cloth and leaving a trail of crimson droplets behind her, markers for those who followed. In the distance, the baying of hounds rose above the wind's moan, the sound crawling up her spine like icy fingers. 3 days she had been running. 3 days since she had fled Helena with nothing but the clothes on her back, a small leather satchel clutched to her chest in the knowledge that to return would mean death. Through the curtain of falling snow, Becca spotted the silhouette of buildings rising from the whiteness, a ranch dark and silent in the growing storm. No lamps burned in the windows, no smoke curled from the chimney. But there to the left of the main house stood a barn large enough to offer shelter from both the cold and those who hunted her. She paused at the edge of the property, breath ragged. The dogs' voices grew louder. The sound of hoofbeats echoed across the frozen land. Decision made, she pushed forward, legs trembling with exhaustion as she waded through deepening snow. The barn door protested with a low creak as she slipped inside, bringing with her a swirl of snowflakes that danced in the sudden stillness before settling to the ground. The scent of hay and horses filled her nostrils, warm and alive compared to the sterile chill of the night. Becca stumbled to an empty stall in the far corner, collapsing into a pile of straw. Her fingers, numb from cold, fumbled with the clasp of her satchel, finally withdrawing a small knife with a pearl handle, a wedding gift from a man whose face now twisted with rage in her nightmares. The knife's blade caught what little moonlight filtered through the cracks in the barn walls as she held it close, its presence, both comfort and reminder. Outside, the wind continued its assault on the world, rattling the wooden boards as if determined to expose her hiding place. She huddled deeper into the straw, pulling her thin coat tighter around her shoulders. The cold had settled into her bones, yet fear kept sleep at bay. Instead, she listened to the horses shifting in their stalls, to the rhythm of her own heart, gradually slowing to the howl of the storm that had perhaps covered her tracks. In that moment of fragile safety, Becca allowed herself to face the truth that had been chasing her longer than the men with their dogs and guns. She could not keep running forever. Sooner or later, the world would force her hand, to fight, to surrender, or to disappear entirely. The barn door opened with a violent gust of wind and snow. A massive silhouette filled the threshold, lantern held high. Becca pressed herself further into the shadows, knife clutched to her chest, breath held. "I know you're in here." The voice was deep, weathered like the Montana landscape. "I saw the tracks." The lantern's glow swept across the barn floor, inching closer to her hiding place. Becca calculated her chances. The door was 20 feet away, the man blocking her only exit. Her legs ached from days of running. The wound on her arm had reopened during her final sprint to the barn. The light found her. "Stand up," slowly. She rose from the straw, knife held before her with a hand that refused to tremble despite her fear. The lantern illuminated her adversary, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that might have been handsome once, before life carved its disappointments into the skin. A long scar ran from his left temple down his cheek, disappearing into a beard flecked with gray. His eyes, startlingly blue against his windburned face, assessed her with a gaze that missed nothing. Not the blood staining her sleeve, not the quality of her clothing beneath the dirt and wear, not the knife that seemed laughably small against his imposing frame. "That's a mighty small blade to be threatening a man with," he said, voice surprisingly gentle for someone of his size. "It's sharp enough," Becca replied, hating how her voice cracked from thirst and fear. The man nodded slowly as if conceding her point. He set the lantern on a nearby post, its light casting long shadows across the barn floor. "You're bleeding." "It's nothing." "Doesn't look like nothing." He made no move toward her. "Those your tracks I've been seeing around my property the past hour? Or should I be expecting more visitors on a night like this?" The implication wasn't lost on her. He knew someone was following her. "I'm alone," she said. "I just needed shelter from the storm. I'll be gone by morning." With that arm and in this blizzard, you won't make it 5 miles. His assessment was matter-of-fact without pity or judgment. Who's after you? Becca tightened her grip on the knife. No one of concern to you. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, there and gone in an instant. Ma'am, when armed men cross my property in the dead of winter, hunting something or someone, it becomes my concern. The sound of the barn door opening again startled them both. An older man with a shock of white hair beneath a worn hat stomped snow from his boots as he entered. Mr. Everett riders approaching from the East Road, 4, maybe 5 of them. The first man, Everett, didn't take his eyes off Becca. Get back to the house, Harold. Lock the doors. But, sir, do it now. The older man cast a suspicious glance at Becca before retreating, muttering under his breath about strangers in trouble. Everett stepped closer to Becca, close enough that she could see flecks of lighter blue in his eyes, close enough that the knife between them seemed even more absurd. You have about 2 minutes to decide, ma'am. Either you tell me who's after you and why I should risk my ranch to hide you, or I hand you over to whoever comes knocking. Becca swallowed hard, mind racing through the limited options before her. The truth would condemn her. A lie might save her tonight, but would unravel by morning. My name is Rebecca Hayes, she said, voice steadier than she felt. My husband, Victor Blackwood, is trying to kill me. Something flickered in Everett's eyes, recognition perhaps, or understanding. The banker from Helena. She nodded. And why would a respected businessman want his wife dead? Because I know what he did. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. And because he believes I killed him first. For a long moment, Everett said nothing, his face unreadable in the lantern's glow. Outside, the sound of approaching horses grew louder, cutting through the storm's howl. Finally, he extended his hand, not for her knife, but toward her bleeding arm. Come with me, now. Why should I trust you? You shouldn't, he replied simply. But right now, I'm offering the only chance you've got. The dog's baying was close now. Too close. Decision made, Becca lowered her knife and followed Everett to the back of the barn, where he slid aside a portion of the wall to reveal a narrow passage. Root cellar, he explained tersely. Stay there, don't make a sound. Becca hesitated at the threshold of the dark space. You don't even know me. Everett's expression hardened. I know enough about men who hunt women through snowstorms. He gestured to the hidden door. Your choice, Mrs. Blackwood. Or is it Hayes? Hayes, she answered firmly. It's Hayes. She stepped into the darkness, clutching her satchel to her chest, as Everett closed the false wall behind her. Through a crack in the boards, she watched him kick straw over the bloodstains she'd left, then move to greet the approaching riders as if he had nothing to hide. The root cellar smelled of earth and preserved vegetables. Becca sank to the floor back against the cool dirt wall and listened to the muffled voices above. Everett's deep and steady, another man's sharp with authority. Though she couldn't make out the words, the tone was clear questions, denials more questions. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The wound on her arm had stopped bleeding, but the pain remained a constant reminder of how close she'd come to death 3 nights ago. She closed her eyes, remembering the look on Victor's face as the knife, her knife, had sliced across his forearm. Not pain, not even surprise, but pure hatred, as if she'd confirmed everything he'd ever thought about her. The sudden silence above startled her. Footsteps crossed the barn floor. Then the main door opened and closed. Had they left, or was Everett leading them to her hiding place by another route? The false wall slid open, flooding the cellar with lantern light. Everett stood there, expression grim. They're gone for now, he said. But they'll be back at first light to search the property properly. Then I should go. Becca struggled to her feet, ignoring the protest of her exhausted muscles. In this storm, you'd be dead before dawn. Everett shook his head. Besides, they've left men watching the roads. You should have turned me in, she said quietly. It would have been simpler. Something like amusement flickered in his eyes. Ms. Hayes, nothing about this situation strikes me as simple. He offered his hand to help her climb out of the cellar. Come, we need to tend that arm before infection sets in. Becca hesitated, then placed her hand in his, surprised by the gentleness in his calloused grip. Why are you helping me? Everett didn't answer immediately. He led her through the snow toward the main house, a sturdy 2-story structure built of logs and determination. Only when they reached the porch did he turn to her, snowflakes catching in his beard and hair. Let's just say I recognize a hunted animal when I see one. His eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary. And I've never had much fondness for hunters who prey on the desperate. The warmth of the house engulfed her as they entered, so intense after days in the cold that tears sprang to her eyes. A fire blazed in the stone hearth of a spacious living room, its light playing across worn but well-kept furniture. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with volumes whose spines showed the wear of frequent reading. The older man, Harold, stood by the fire, his face tightening with disapproval at the sight of Becca. "Mr. Everett, you can't be serious," he began, "bringing her here after those men." "That's enough, Harold." Everett cut him off. "Fetch the medical kit from the kitchen and put on water for tea." Harold's mouth snapped shut, but his eyes spoke volumes as he stalked from the room. "Don't mind him," Everett said, gesturing for Becca to sit in an armchair near the fire. "Harold's been with my family since I was a boy. He's protective." "He's right to be concerned," Becca replied, sinking gratefully into the chair. "I've brought danger to your door." Everett removed his coat, revealing a frame shaped by years of hard work. "Danger finds this place without invitation, Miss Hayes." He knelt before her, gently taking her injured arm. "May I?" At her nod, he carefully rolled up her sleeve, revealing the knife wound, a deep gash that ran from just below her elbow halfway to her wrist. His touch was clinical, assessing rather than lingering. "Your husband did this?" "He tried for worse," she answered softly. "This was defensive." Harold returned with a wooden box and a pot of hot water, which he set down with more force than necessary before retreating to hover in the doorway, a self-appointed sentinel. Everett cleaned the wound with practiced efficiency, his large hands surprisingly deft. "You'll need stitches." Becca nodded, steeling herself for the pain. "I know. Harold, bring the whiskey." The old man disappeared again, returning moments later with a bottle and a single glass, which he set down before resuming his watchful position. Everett poured a generous measure. "Drink. It'll help with what comes next." She accepted the glass, downing the amber liquid in a single swallow. It burned a path to her stomach, spreading warmth through her chilled body. "Now," Everett said, threading a needle with steady hands, "while I work. Perhaps you'd care to explain why the banker's wife is running through a snowstorm with a knife wound and a sheriff's posse on her trail." Becca watched him pierce her skin with the needle, the pain distant, thanks to the whiskey and her own exhaustion. "It's a long story. We got a long night ahead of us," he replied, making the first careful stitch. "And I find myself in need of convincing that I haven't made a terrible mistake by hiding you." She studied his face as he worked, trying to read the man who had, for reasons she couldn't fathom, chosen to shelter her. "What's your name, your full name?" "Owen Everett," he answered, without looking up from his task. "Owner of Ravenwood Ranch, such as it is." "And you live here alone, Mr. Everett? Just you and Harold?" A shadow crossed his features. "Now it's just us. Once it was different." His tone discouraged further questions on the matter. "Your story, Ms. Hayes. Start with how a banker's wife comes to be using her maiden name while fleeing her husband." Becca took a deep breath, wincing as Owen tied off the first stitch and began another. "I married Victor Blackwood 5 years ago. I was 22, naive, the daughter of a rancher who'd fallen on hard times after my mother died." The familiar ache of those memories momentarily overwhelmed the physical pain. "Victor offered security, respectability. My father encouraged the match. And it wasn't what you expected." Owen guessed, his eyes still focused on his work. "It was a cage, gilded at first, then increasingly bare." She watched the needle dip and rise through her flesh. "Victor is not the man Helena believes him to be. In public, he's generous, charming, civic-minded. In private, he's a monster." Owen finished for her, his voice matter-of-fact. Becca's eyes snapped to his face, surprised by his bluntness. "Yes." "And did you try to kill him, Ms. Hayes, as he claims?" The directness of the question stole her breath for a moment. In the corner, Harold shifted, clearly interested in her answer. "No," she said firmly, "but I did defend myself 3 nights ago when he came at me with that same knife." She nodded toward the pearl-handled blade that now sat on the side table. "He discovered that I'd found certain discrepancies in his banking records, transactions that didn't add up, properties changing hands under suspicious circumstances." Owen tied off another stitch. his movements precise despite the gravity of their conversation. So you threatened to expose him. I was going to leave him, Becca corrected. Take what evidence I had to the federal marshal in Butte. Victor anticipated this. He'd been drinking waiting for me in our bedroom. The memory sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. He said if I thought I could ruin him, he would make sure I never left that room alive. But you did, Owen observed, starting the final stitch. I fought back. For the first time in 5 years, I fought back. The admission felt like both confession and triumph. When he came at me with the knife, I managed to turn it against him. Cut his arm worse than this. He fell, struck his head on the bedpost. I thought he was dead. But he wasn't. No, I fled anyway, taking only what I could carry and the documents I'd found. By morning, Victor had spread the word that I'd attempted to murder him, stolen from his bank, that I was dangerous, unstable. Bitterness crept into her voice. A woman scorned, driven mad by her inability to provide him with an heir. Owen finished the last stitch and began wrapping clean bandages around her arm. And the men following you, bounty hunters. Victor has offered $5,000 for my return. Alive. Her laugh was hollow. He wants the satisfaction of seeing me hang publicly. Harold scoffed from his position by the door. Convenient tale, isn't it, sir? The abused wife, the evil husband, the heroic escape. Dime novels are full of such stories. Owen shot the older man a warning look before turning back to Becca. Do you have these documents you mentioned, the evidence against your husband? She patted the satchel, still clutched in her left hand. Here, along with what little money I could take, and my mother's locket. The only things of value Victor couldn't legally claim as his. Owen finished bandaging her arm and stood his tall frame casting long shadows in the firelight. You should rest. Harold will show you to a room upstairs. He held up a hand to silence the older man's imminent protest. In the morning, we'll decide what comes next. Becca rose unsteadily to her feet, the events of the day, and the whiskey conspiring to make the room tilt slightly. Mr. Everett, I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me yet, Ms. Hayes. His expression was solemn. I haven't decided whether to believe you. Harold led her upstairs with obvious reluctance, showing her to a small but clean bedroom at the end of the hall. Mr. Everett has taken leave of his senses, he muttered, lighting the lamp on the bedside table. Bringing trouble into this house after everything. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, Becca said quietly. I'll be gone as soon as the storm passes. The old man's shrewd eyes assessed her. Women have brought nothing but grief to this place, miss. Remember that. With that cryptic warning, he left, closing the door firmly behind him. Exhaustion claimed Becca almost as soon as her head touched the pillow. She slept deeply for the first time in days, the pearl-handled knife under her pillow, the satchel of documents clutched to her chest, even in slumber. She woke to gray daylight filtering through curtained windows and the smell of coffee and wood smoke. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous night crashed over her with the force of a wave. The wound on her arm throbbed dully beneath its bandages as she sat up, noting that someone had placed a basin of water soap and a towel on the dresser. Beside them lay folded clothing, a simple calico dress far too large for her frame, but clean and whole unlike her own travel-worn garments. After washing as best she could, Becca changed into the offered dress using a length of ribbon from her satchel to cinch the waist. The result was hardly fashionable, but dignity had become a luxury she could no longer afford. The hallway outside her room was empty, the house quiet save for the occasional crack of wood in the fire downstairs. Becca descended cautiously, following the scent of coffee, to a large kitchen at the back of the house. Owen stood at the cast-iron stove, his back to her, as he tended to something in a pan. Good morning, she said softly. He turned spatula in hand, his expression unreadable. Ms. Hayes. He nodded toward the coffee pot. Help yourself. Cups in the cabinet to your right. Becca did as suggested, grateful for the rich aroma that promised warmth and alertness. Thank you for the clothes. They were my wife's, Owen replied, his tone neutral as he returned his attention to the stove. They'll do until yours can be washed. The casual mention of a wife raised questions Becca wasn't sure she should ask. She sipped her coffee instead, appreciating its bitter strength. The storm's passed, Owen continued, but it left nearly 2 feet of snow. Roads won't be passable for a day or two. The men who were looking for me left at dawn, heading back toward town. He transferred eggs and bacon from the pan to 2 plates. But they'll be back. Sit, eat. You'll need your strength. Becca hesitated, then took a seat at the large wooden table that dominated the center of the kitchen. Where's Harold? Checking on the livestock. Owen set a plate before her, then took the seat opposite with his own meal. He doesn't approve of you being here. I gathered that, she replied dryly. He's protective of you. Of the ranch, of its reputation. Owen met her gaze directly. There's been talk enough about Ravenwood without adding a fugitive to the gossip. Becca paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. Talk. Something closed in Owen's expression, like shutters drawn against a storm. Eat your breakfast, Ms. Hayes. Then we need to discuss your situation. They ate in silence, Becca too hungry after days of sparse meals to refuse the simple but hearty food. When they'd finished, Owen refilled their coffee cups before leaning back in his chair, studying her with those penetrating blue eyes. I read the documents you brought, he said finally. Becca's heart skipped a beat. You went through my things. I needed to know if you were telling the truth. His tone suggested he felt no remorse for the invasion. If those papers are genuine, your husband has been systematically acquiring properties throughout the territory, through foreclosure, often after manipulating the loans to ensure failure. They're genuine, Becca confirmed. Victor boasted about his acquisitions to me, thinking I was too simple to understand the implications. He didn't realize I'd been helping my father with ranch accounts since I was 15. Owen nodded slowly. And you believe he killed for these properties? I know he did. Becca's hands tightened around her coffee cup. The Wilcox Ranch north of Helena. James Wilcox refused to sell even when the bank called in his loan early. He was found hanged in his barn 2 days later. The coroner ruled it suicide, but his widow told me James had sworn he'd never take his own life. It was against his faith. One death doesn't make a pattern. There were others, 3 in the last 2 years, all ruled accidents or suicides, all involving properties Victor wanted. Becca met Owen's skeptical gaze. I lived with the man, Mr. Everett. I saw his rage, his obsession with control. Is it so hard to believe he'd remove obstacles to his ambition? Owen's expression remained carefully neutral. What I believe doesn't matter, Ms. Hayes. It's what a court would believe. Your word against his. And in this territory, a banker's word carries more weight than his wife's, especially a wife accused of attempted murder. Then you don't believe me, Becca said flatly. I believe you're running from something genuinely dangerous, Owen replied. Whether it's your husband's violence or the consequences of your own actions remains to be seen. The front door opened with a blast of cold air and Harold stomped into the kitchen, snow melting from his boots and hat. His expression darkened at the sight of Becca seated comfortably at the table. Visitors coming up the East Road, he announced. Sheriff Reeves and 3 others. Owen rose immediately, his manner shifting from contemplative to alert. How far? 10 minutes, maybe less. Harold cast a significant look at Becca. Time enough to decide what to do with her. Becca stood, heart pounding. I should hide. The cellar, perhaps. No, Owen cut her off. They'll search the outbuildings first thing. The cellar would be too obvious. He thought for a moment, then turned to Harold. Wake Miss Hayes upstairs to Margaret's room. The connecting door to my study. She can hide there if necessary. Harold's eyes widened. Sir, you can't mean to. Do it, Harold, now. Owen's tone brooked no argument. He turned to Becca. If they come inside, stay quiet no matter what you hear. Understand? She nodded, throat tight with fear. Go, Owen urged, and take your satchel. Leave nothing downstairs that suggests your presence. Harold led her upstairs with obvious reluctance, muttering under his breath about foolishness and danger. The room he showed her to was larger than the one she'd slept in, clearly a woman's bedroom, with feminine touches that had begun to gather dust. A silver-backed hairbrush on the vanity, a shawl draped over a reading chair, books on the nightstand with pressed flowers marking pages that would never be turned again. Margaret's room, Becca guessed softly. Harold's face tightened with grief and something darker. Mrs. Everett's room, yes, God rest her. He crossed to a door on the far wall, opening it to reveal a small study lined with bookshelves. You can hide here if need be, behind the desk, and for God's sake, be still. The sound of horses approaching reached them even through the closed windows. Harold moved to peer outside. Sheriff Reeves, he identified. Gabriel Kane with him, that's the bounty hunter who was here last night. And two others I don't recognize. He turned to Becca, his expression grave. You'd best get in there now. They're dismounting. Becca slipped into the study, positioning herself behind the heavy oak desk where she would be hidden from casual view. Through the partially open door, she could see a slice of Margaret's bedroom. The four-poster bed, the Vanity Herald standing by the window like a sentinel. Voices drifted up from below. Owen's deep and steady, another man's sharper, more authoritative. Floorboards creaked as multiple people entered the house. Becca held her breath, straining to hear. Appreciate your cooperation, Everett, the unfamiliar voice was saying. Blackwood's offering a substantial reward for information leading to his wife's capture. As I told your men last night, Sheriff, Owen replied, I haven't seen anyone matching her description. The storm was too fierce for travel. Mind if we look around? Anyway, just to be thorough. My home is my own Reeves, unless you have a warrant. I do, as a matter of fact. A rustling of papers, signed by Judge Wilson himself, gives us the right to search any property where Rebecca Blackwood might be hiding. A long pause, then Owen's voice tight with controlled anger. Vitrudino, but you'll respect my privacy. Any damage to my property, and I'll hold you personally responsible. Footsteps below, moving from room to room, drawers opening and closing, the thud of boots on stairs. Harold moved swiftly to the study door. They're coming up, he whispered. Not a sound. Becca pressed herself further behind the desk, clutching her satchel to her chest. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain it would betray her presence. The bedroom door opened. Through the crack in the study door, Becca could see two men enter. A lean, sharp-faced man with a sheriff's badge and a younger deputy with nervous eyes. This room looks occupied, the sheriff observed. It was my wife's, Owen's voice came from the doorway. I keep it as she left it. Your wife. Margaret wasn't it. The sheriff's tone held a note of something unpleasant. Tragic business, that. I'd prefer not to discuss it, Owen replied coldly. The sheriff circled the room, running his fingers along the vanity, picking up the hairbrush. No dust on this. Someone's been using it recently. I have a housekeeper who comes in twice a week, Owen lied smoothly. She keeps the rooms clean out of respect. The sheriff didn't sound convinced. He moved toward the study door, and Becca's breath caught in her throat. That's my private study, Owen said, stepping into the room to block the sheriff's path. Personal papers, ranch accounts. Nothing that concerns you or your search. Everything concerns me when I'm hunting a fugitive, Everett. The sheriff tried to step around him. Owen didn't budge. The warrant gives you the right to search for a person, not to rifle through my business affairs. The tension in the room was palpable. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, a silent battle of wills. Finally, the sheriff stepped back. Fine, but if I find out you're hiding her, you won't, Owen stated firmly, because she isn't here. The men left the bedroom, their footsteps retreating down the hall to search the remaining rooms. Becca allowed herself to breathe again, though her heart continued to race. Harold appeared in the study doorway, his expression grim. Stay put, he whispered. They're searching the entire house. The next half hour passed in agonizing slowness as the search party moved through the house and outbuildings. Becca remained frozen behind the desk, every noise from below sending a fresh wave of fear through her. Finally, she heard the front door open and close, followed by the sound of horses departing. Still, she didn't move until Harold returned to the study. They're gone, he announced, for now. Becca rose on shaky legs, her muscles protesting after being held in one position for so long. Thank you, she whispered. Harold's expression remained stern. Don't thank me. Thank Mr. Everett, though heaven knows why he's risking everything for a stranger. With that, he turned and left the room. Becca followed him downstairs to find Owen standing by the front window, watching the riders disappear down the snow-covered road. They'll be back, he said without turning. Reeves doesn't believe me. I'm sorry, Becca said softly. I've put you in an impossible position. Owen turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Not impossible, just dangerous. He crossed to the sideboard and poured himself a small measure of whiskey, downing it in one swallow. Sheriff Reeves is in your husband's pocket. Has been for years. How do you know that? A shadow crossed Owen's face. Let's just say I've had my own dealings with Silver Pines law enforcement. Harold cleared his throat from the doorway. Sir, if I may suggest, Perhaps it would be best if the lady moved on once the roads are clear, for everyone's safety. Owen shot the older man a look that silenced him. Ms. Hayes will stay until we determine the best course of action. In the meantime, she'll need to earn her keep. He turned to Becca. Can you cook? The question was so unexpected after the tension of the search that Becca almost laughed. Yes, quite well, actually. Good, you'll help with meals and household chores. If anyone comes calling, you're my cousin from back east, come to help after my recent loss. His tone made it clear he would brook no argument on this arrangement. Sir, Harold protested, you can't mean to. I can and I do. Owen cut him off. My decision is final. Harold, the old man's mouth snapped shut, but his eyes blazed with disapproval as he stalked from the room. He hates me, Becca observed quietly. He hates change, Owen corrected, and strangers, and anything that reminds him of. He trailed off, then shook his head as if clearing unwanted thoughts. It doesn't matter. What matters is keeping you alive long enough to determine the truth. The truth, Becca echoed. Owen fixed her with those piercing blue eyes. Yes, Ms. Hayes, the truth about your husband, about what happened that night, about who you really are. He moved closer, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the flecks of gray in his beard. Because I've taken an enormous risk for you, and I need to know if I've made a terrible mistake. The intensity of his gaze made her heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. I've told you everything, she said softly. No, he replied just as softly. I don't think you have, but you will. And with that, he turned and left the room, leaving Becca alone with the weight of his words and the realization that she had traded one precarious situation for another, one where her survival depended on the trust of a man with secrets of his own. Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle now, blanketing the world in pristine white, a deceptive purity that hid the dangers beneath. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the world transformed into a glittering expanse of white that stretched to the horizon. Becca stood at the kitchen window, watching the sun rise over the snow-covered mountains in the distance. For a moment, the beauty of it stole her breath. This land that could kill with its cold indifference, yet offered such transcendent vistas as compensation. Morning, Owen's voice startled her from her reverie. He stood in the doorway, already dressed for outdoor work, his breath visible in the still cold kitchen. Good morning, she replied, moving to the stove where she'd already stoked the fire and set coffee to brew. I hope you don't mind. I thought I'd start breakfast. Something like approval flickered in his eyes. Not at all. He accepted the cup of coffee she offered, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. You're up early. Old habits, Becca explained, turning to slice bread for toasting. On my father's ranch, everyone worked, even the rancher's daughter. Owen leaned against the counter, watching her move about the kitchen with growing efficiency as she found her way around. Your father's ranch. Where was it? Near Bozeman, she replied, the mention of her childhood home bringing a bittersweet ache. The Double Creek. Nothing grand, but it was beautiful. Good grazing land, a creek that never ran dry. What happened to it? Becca's hands stilled momentarily on the bread knife. My father fell ill after my mother passed. Medical bills, bad luck with the herd. By the time Victor came calling, we were nearly bankrupt. The familiar guilt washed over her. Father saw marriage to Victor as my salvation, a way to secure my future. And her smile was sad as she resumed slicing. Victor paid off the ranch's debts as a wedding gift. When my father died 6 months later, the property reverted to Victor as my husband. The irony still tasted bitter. He sold it within the year, said it wasn't a profitable investment. Owen's expression darkened. Your husband sounds like a calculating man. You have no idea, Becca murmured, laying the bread slices on the stovetop to toast. Victor plans everything 10 moves ahead like a chess master. Nothing is coincidence with him. Nothing is wasted. Harold entered the kitchen, his eyebrows rising at the sight of Becca cooking. I see you've made yourself at home, he observed dryly. Ms. Hayes is earning her keep, as we discussed. Owen replied, a warning in his tone. She'll be handling household duties while she's with us. And how long might that be, sir? Harold's question held an edge. As long as necessary. Owen set down his coffee cup with finality. Now we need to check the north pasture fence. That last storm likely took down sections. Harold clearly wanted to argue but thought better of it. I'll saddle the horses. After he left, Owen turned back to Becca. Don't let him bother you. Harold's bark is worse than his bite. He doesn't trust me, Becca said, cracking eggs into a bowl. I can't blame him for that. Trust is earned in this country, Owen replied. He hesitated, then added, Harold was close to my wife. Her death, it hit him hard. Becca glanced up from her task. May I ask what happened to her? Owen's face closed like a door slamming shut. No, he said simply. You may not. He grabbed his coat from a hook by the door. I'll be back by midday. Stay inside away from windows if possible. Just because Reeves left doesn't mean they're not watching the property. With that, he was gone, leaving Becca alone with questions she knew better than to pursue and a growing sense that Ravenwood Ranch harbored secrets as deep and dangerous as her own. The days fell into a pattern. Becca rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, spent her mornings cleaning and organizing the house that had clearly lacked a woman's touch for some time, and her afternoons cooking dinner, while trying to avoid Harold's suspicious glances. Owen remained an enigma, courteous but distant, revealing little about himself while observing her with those penetrating blue eyes that seemed to strip away her defenses. A week passed. The snow began to melt under the winter sun, revealing patches of frozen earth beneath. Roads became passable again. Twice more riders came to Ravenwood, once the sheriff, once a man Owen identified as one of Victor's associates. Each time Becca hid in the study connected to Margaret's room, heart pounding as she listened to Owen smoothly deny any knowledge of her whereabouts. On the 8th day, Owen announced at breakfast that he needed to go into town for supplies. Silver Pine? Becca asked, unable to hide her alarm. Is that wise? Necessary, Owen replied. We're running low on essentials, and I need to hear what's being said. He studied her for a moment. You'll come with me. Becca nearly dropped the plate she was holding. What? But the risk is greater if you stay here alone, he finished for her. Harold needs to check the western boundary today. If someone came while we were both gone, he let the implication hang in the air. But won't I be recognized? Not if we're careful. Owen's expression was thoughtful. Your husband's descriptions mention a well-dressed blonde woman. With your hair covered and in Margaret's old clothes, you'll look different enough. He smiled slightly at her skeptical expression. Besides, sometimes the best place to hide is in plain sight. No one will expect Victor Blackwood's refined wife to be accompanying a reclusive rancher to town. Despite her misgivings, Becca found herself bundled into the wagon later that morning, a woolen shawl covering her dark hair, Margaret's old coat and dress disguising her figure. Owen sat beside her on the bench, reins in his gloved hands, his presence solid and reassuring, despite the danger of their expedition. The road to Silver Pine wound through snow-covered hills and stands of pine, the winter landscape breathtaking in its stark beauty. For the first time in weeks, Becca felt a sense of freedom, of possibility, as they traveled beneath the vast Montana sky. It's beautiful, she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. Owen glanced at her, something warming in his usually guarded expression. Yes, he agreed. That's why I stay despite everything. This land gets in your blood. Like a fever, Becca mused. Beautiful but potentially fatal. His low chuckle surprised her. The first real laugh she'd heard from him. An apt description, Ms. Hayes. The town of Silver Pine appeared as they crested a hill, a collection of wooden buildings strung along a main street, smoke rising from chimneys against the cold blue sky. Despite its small size, the town boasted the essential businesses of frontier life: a general store, saloon, blacksmith, small hotel, and the sheriff's office, its presence marked by a hitching post where a horse dozed in the winter sun. Owen drew the wagon to a halt outside the general store, his manner shifting subtly, more alert, his eyes scanning the street before he helped Becca down. Remember, he said quietly, you're my cousin Elizabeth from Pennsylvania, here to help after Margaret's passing. Speak as little as possible. Let me do the talking. Becca nodded, heart pounding beneath her borrowed coat as they entered the store. The warmth inside was welcome after the cold ride, as was the familiar scent of coffee, leather, and dry goods that reminded her of similar establishments in her youth. A plump woman in her 60s stood behind the counter, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her eyes widened at the sight of Owen. Mr. Everett twice in one winter must be some kind of record. Her gaze shifted to Becca, curiosity plain in her expression. Mrs. Cooper. Owen nodded in greeting. We need supplies. And this is my cousin, Elizabeth. She's staying at Ravenwood for a time. The woman's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. Is she now? Well, welcome to Silver Pine, Miss. Hayes, Becca supplied, keeping her voice soft. Elizabeth Hayes, thank you for the welcome, Mrs. Cooper. The older woman studied her with undisguised interest. Hayes, any relation to the Bozeman Hayes family, had a ranch called Double Creek, if I recall. Becca's blood ran cold. How could this woman possibly... Owen stepped smoothly into the pause. Different Hayes entirely. Elizabeth is from my mother's side back east. He handed Mrs. Cooper a list. We'll need these items, please. And information about when the mail coach will resume its route to Helena. Mrs. Cooper reluctantly turned her attention to the list. Mail coach started running again yesterday. Should be through Silver Pine tomorrow morning. She began gathering items from shelves behind the counter. You planning a trip to the capital, Mr. Everett? That would be quite the event. You've hardly left your ranch these past 3 years. Just need to send some correspondence, Owen replied neutrally, as Mrs. Cooper bustled about filling their order. The store door opened, admitting a blast of cold air and a man Becca recognized immediately. Gabriel Reeves, the sheriff who had searched Ravenwood. She turned away quickly, pretending to examine a shelf of canned goods. Everett, Reeves acknowledged, his tone cool. Didn't expect to see you in town so soon after our last conversation. Owen's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Sheriff, just restocking after the storm. Reeves's gaze shifted to Becca's back and she could feel his scrutiny like a physical touch. And who's your companion? My cousin Elizabeth Hayes from Pennsylvania. Owen moved slightly, positioning himself between Becca and the lawman. Elizabeth, this is Sheriff Reeves. Becca had no choice but to turn and acknowledge the introduction. She kept her eyes downcast, offering a demure nod. Sheriff. Reeves studied her face longer than courtesy dictated. Hayes, you say interesting coincidence, that name. Not particularly, Owen countered. It's a common enough surname. Indeed. Reeves smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. Well, Miss Hayes, welcome to Silver Pine. I hope your stay with your cousin is educational. The emphasis he placed on the last word sent a chill down Becca's spine. Did he suspect, or was he simply trying to unnerve them? Thank you, Sheriff, she murmured. Blackwood's raised the reward, Everett, Reeves said casually, turning back to Owen. $10,000 now for information leading to his wife's capture. Dead or alive. Owen's expression remained impassive. Sounds desperate. Sounds like a man who wants justice, Reeves countered. His wife tried to kill him, stole valuable bank documents. That sort of thing can't go unpunished. His gaze drifted back to Becca. Wouldn't you agree, Miss Hayes? I wouldn't presume to have an opinion on such matters, Becca replied carefully, not knowing the circumstances. Reeves's smile widened. Wise policy. He tipped his hat. Good day to you both. At the door, he paused. Oh, and Everett, I'll be by to check on you again soon, keeping the peace and all that. After he left, the tension in the store was palpable. Mrs. Cooper looked between Owen and Becca with renewed interest. That was odd, she observed. Sheriff seemed mighty interested in your cousin. Reeves has always been too interested in other people's business, Owen replied tersely. How much for the supplies, Mrs. Cooper? The remainder of their transaction proceeded swiftly, Owen clearly eager to leave before further complications arose. As they loaded the supplies into the wagon, Becca felt exposed, certain that eyes watched them from every window. He knows, she whispered as Owen helped her onto the bench. Reeves knows who I am. He suspects, Owen corrected, climbing up beside her. But he doesn't know. If he did, you'd be in chains already. He flicked the reins, setting the horses in motion. Still, we need to be careful. Very careful. They had nearly reached the edge of town when a figure stepped into the road, forcing Owen to pull the horses to an abrupt halt. The man who blocked their path was tall and lean, with the hard eyes of someone who had seen too much of life's ugliness. He wore a long duster despite the cold, his hand resting casually near the gun at his hip. Elias Kane, Owen identified him in a low voice. Bounty hunter, one of the best, or worst, depending on your perspective. Kane approached the wagon, his gaze fixed on Becca with the intensity of a predator sighting prey. Afternoon, Everett, he drawled. Thought I recognized your wagon. His eyes never left Becca's face. Aren't you going to introduce me to your lovely companion, my cousin Elizabeth? Owen replied, his voice betraying none of the tension Becca could feel radiating from him. We're in a hurry, Kane. What do you want? Just being neighborly, Kane smiled, the expression chilling in its insincerity. Heard you might have had some unexpected visitors at Ravenwood lately. Thought I'd check if you needed any assistance. I manage my own affairs, Owen said coldly. Now, if you'll excuse us. Kane stepped closer to the wagon, close enough that Becca could smell tobacco and whiskey on his breath. You know, Miss Elizabeth, you remind me of someone. A woman I've been hired to find. His eyes narrowed. Banker's wife from Helena. Dangerous woman, they say. Cut her husband with his own knife and left him for dead. Becca's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to meet Kane's gaze steadily. I'm afraid you're mistaken, sir. I've only just arrived from Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, is it? Kane's smile widened. Funny you don't sound like an Easterner. Your accent is pure Montana. He reached up as if to touch her face. In fact, I'd wager. Owen's hand shot out, gripping Kane's wrist with enough force to make the bounty hunter wince. That's enough, Kane. My cousin isn't accustomed to Western familiarity. Back away from my wagon. Now. For a tense moment, the two men locked gazes, a silent battle of wills, with Becca's fate hanging in the balance. Then Kane slowly withdrew his hand, though his smile remained. No offense meant, he said, stepping back from the wagon. Just doing my job. $10,000 is a powerful incentive to be thorough. Your thoroughness is noted, Owen replied coldly. Good day, Kane. He snapped the reins and the horses lurched forward, leaving the bounty hunter standing in the road, his calculating gaze following them as they departed. Neither Becca nor Owen spoke until Silverpine was well behind them. Finally, Owen broke the silence, his voice tight with anger. That was a mistake. I shouldn't have brought you. You couldn't have known, Becca said softly. I should have anticipated it. He shook his head in self-recrimination. Kane is dangerous, Ms. Hayes, more dangerous than Reeves. He doesn't care about the law, only the money. And he's like a bloodhound. Once he has a scent, he doesn't give up. Do you think he recognized me? Owen's grim expression was answer enough. We need to be prepared. Kane won't come alone next time. The implications hung heavy in the air between them. Becca stared at the road ahead, the brief sense of freedom she'd felt earlier, now replaced by renewed dread. Perhaps I should leave, she suggested quietly. Take my chances elsewhere before I bring more trouble to your door. Owen's hands tightened on the reins. And go where? Without money, without allies, with bounty hunters on your trail. He shook his head firmly. No, Ravenwood is your best chance. Why? The question had been building in Becca for days. Why risk so much for a stranger? A woman who might be a murderer for all you know? Owen was silent for so long that Becca thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. Because I know what it's like to be hunted for something you didn't do. He glanced at her, his blue eyes holding hers for a moment that seemed to stretch between them. And because no one stood for me when I needed it most. The confession hung in the air, a glimpse behind the walls Owen had built around himself. Becca wanted to ask more, to understand the pain she glimpsed in those brief words, but she recognized the costs such revelations extracted. Instead, she simply nodded, accepting both his decision and the unspoken bond it created between them. Two people marked by the world's judgment, finding unlikely sanctuary in each other's company. As Ravenwood Ranch came into view, its sturdy buildings a promise of temporary safety, Becca made a silent vow whatever came next. Whatever dangers awaited, she would not squander this second chance. For the first time since fleeing Helena, she allowed herself to imagine a future beyond mere survival, a future where truth might triumph over power, where wounds might heal, where broken people might find wholeness again. It was a dangerous hope, perhaps, but hope nonetheless. And in the gathering twilight of a Montana winter, it shone like a distant star, small but undeniable, a light to navigate by in the darkness ahead. The winter sun hung low in the Montana sky, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape of Ravenwood Ranch. 2 weeks had passed since Becca's arrival, 2 weeks of cautious routine that had begun to feel against all odds like something approaching normal. The sharp crack of a rifle shot split the afternoon quiet. Becca lowered the weapon, her ears ringing slightly, despite the wool scarf wrapped around her head. 20 yards away, the tin can she'd been aiming at remained stubbornly upright on the fence post. You're anticipating the recoil, Owen observed from beside her. It's making you jerk the barrel up just before you fire. Becca sighed, her breath forming a cloud in the cold air. I'm sorry, I'm wasting your ammunition. Better to waste bullets in practice than to need a perfect shot and not have it. Owen stepped closer, his tall frame blocking the wind that had been cutting through her coat. Here, try again. He positioned himself behind her, his chest nearly touching her back as he reached around to adjust her grip on the rifle. His hands, encased in worn leather gloves, were steady as they covered hers, showing her how to hold the weapon properly. Breathe in, he instructed, his voice low near her ear. Then halfway out. Hold it. Squeeze, don't pull. Becca tried to focus on the target, but found herself acutely aware of Owen's proximity, of the solid warmth of him against the cold day, of the faint scent of pine and wood smoke that seemed to cling to him. She drew in a breath as instructed, released it halfway, and squeezed the trigger. The can flew off the fence post with a satisfying ping. There, Owen said, stepping back. You've got it. Becca lowered the rifle, unable to suppress a small smile of triumph. Finally. Again, he directed, nodding toward the fresh can Harold had grudgingly set up. Without my help this time. She raised the rifle, settled her cheek against the stock, and followed the same sequence of movements. Breathe in. Halfway out. Hold. Squeeze. The second can joined the first in the snow. Good, Owen approved. 5 more, then we'll go in. Your hands must be freezing. Becca nodded, though in truth, she barely felt the cold. The exhilaration of mastering this small skill, of being able to protect herself even in this limited way, warmed her from within. One by one, she knocked the remaining cans from their perches, each success building a confidence she hadn't felt in years. Well done, Owen said when she'd finished. You're a quick study? I had a good teacher, she replied, offering him the rifle. Something flickered in Owen's eyes at the compliment, surprise perhaps, or pleasure quickly suppressed. He took the weapon expertly, checking that the chamber was empty, before slinging it over his shoulder. We should get back, he said, glancing at the sky. Storm's coming in. Becca followed his gaze to the western horizon, where dark clouds gathered like bruises against the pale winter sky. Another one. It's only been 3 days since the last. Welcome to Montana, Owen replied dryly. The weather here doesn't believe in fairness or moderation. As they walked back toward the house, Becca found herself studying Owen's profile. In the 2 weeks she'd spent at Ravenwood, she'd learned little more about him than she had known that first night. He worked from dawn until dusk, spoke rarely but decisively, and treated her with a distant courtesy that occasionally unexpectedly gave way to moments of genuine connection, like the confession he'd made on their return from Silver Pine, or the patient instruction he'd just shown with the rifle. Yet for every glimpse behind his walls, there seemed to be a dozen new mysteries. The locked room upstairs that had been his wife's. The way Harold watched him with a mixture of loyalty and what sometimes looked like fear. The nightmares that occasionally woke her in the darkest hours, Owen's voice crying out from his bedroom down the hall. Something on your mind, Ms. Hayes? Owen asked, catching her stare. Becca looked away quickly. I was just thinking about how little I know about you, considering you've risked your life and livelihood to shelter me. Owen was quiet for several strides, and Becca thought he might ignore the implicit question, as he had so many others. But then he sighed, his breath visible in the cold air. What would you like to know? The unexpected opening caught her off guard. Where are you from? Originally, Virginia, he answered. My family had a small farm there before the war. The war? Becca hesitated. You fought for the Confederacy? No. Owen's tone was firm. I fought for the Union. My father was a staunch abolitionist. It made us unpopular with our neighbors. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Seems I've always had a talent for being on the wrong side of public opinion. Is that why you came west after the war? Owen nodded. There wasn't much left for me in Virginia. My parents died during the fighting fever, not bullets. The farm was burned. I headed west with nothing but my horse and the clothes on my back. And you built all this, Becca observed, gesturing to the ranch buildings ahead. Not alone, Owen corrected. My first wife Emily came with me. We staked our claim together. Becca's pulse quickened at this rare mention of his past. She must have been a brave woman. She was. A shadow crossed Owen's face. Too brave for her own good in the end. Before Becca could ask what he meant, Harold appeared on the porch of the main house, waving urgently. "Riders coming," he called. "4 of them from the direction of Silver Pine." The brief moment of openness vanished as Owen's expression hardened. "Inside," he ordered. "Yes, the hiding place we prepared. Now." Becca needed no further urging. She hurried to the house, heart pounding, and made for the storage space beneath the kitchen floorboards that Owen had shown her after their encounter with Kane in town. It was cramped and dark, but better than the study upstairs, which had proven too obvious during the sheriff's search. She had just pulled the trapdoor closed over her head when she heard the front door open, followed by the heavy tread of multiple boots on the wooden floor. Men's voices, one of them unmistakably Kane's, filled the house. "Appreciate your hospitality, Everett," Kane was saying. "Nasty storm brewing out there. Wouldn't want to be caught in the open when it hits." "You're welcome to wait in the barn," Owen replied, his tone making it clear that the house itself was not on offer. Kane chuckled, the sound sending a chill down Becca's spine, even through the floorboards. "Now that wouldn't be very neighborly, would it? Besides, we've come with news that might interest you." "I doubt that." "Oh, I think you'll find this fascinating," Kane insisted. "Seems Victor Blackwood himself is coming to Silver Pine, arriving on tomorrow's stage from Helena." There was a pause during which Becca imagined Owen's expression remaining carefully neutral. "That's hardly news that concerns me," he said finally. "No," Kane's voice dripped with false innocence. "I thought you might be interested given your recent activities." "I don't know what you're implying, Kane, but—" "Let's not play games, Everett," a new voice cut in, sharper, more authoritative. "Sheriff Reeves, we know she's here." "Who?" Owen asked, his tone betraying nothing. "Rebecca Blackwood," Reeves stated flatly. "Or Hayes, or whatever she's calling herself these days. Your cousin from Pennsylvania." Becca's blood ran cold. They knew. Somehow they knew. "I told you before, Sheriff," Owen replied evenly. "My cousin returned east 3 days ago. If you don't believe me, check with the stagecoach office. She purchased a ticket to Denver connecting to the Eastern Line." A clever lie, Becca thought. One that would take time to verify, given the distances involved. "A convenient story," Reeves observed. "Mind if we look around just to be thorough? Do you have a warrant this time as well?" "Not today, man," Reeves admitted, "but I could return with one." "Then I suggest you do exactly that." Owen's voice had taken on an edge Becca had never heard before. "Until then, my home remains my own." The tension in the room above was palpable even through the floorboards. Becca held her breath, waiting for the confrontation to escalate. "Very well, Everett," Reeves said finally. "We'll do this the official way. But understand this, Blackwood isn't just coming to identify his wife. He's coming with papers that give him legal authority over this property." "What?" Owen's surprise seemed genuine. "What are you talking about?" "Didn't you know?" Kane's voice, again smug with satisfaction. "Blackwood bought up your mortgage from the bank in Helena. He owns your debt now, and word is you're behind on your payments." Becca pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle her gasp. "Victor, it was exactly his method. Find leverage, apply, pressure, watch his opponents crumble." "That's impossible," Owen said, though there was a new uncertainty in his tone. "My arrangement was with First Montana Bank. They wouldn't sell without notifying me." "Banks do all sorts of things these days," Reeves replied, "especially when influential men like Blackwood are involved." "So that's the game." Owen's voice had gone cold. "Blackwood wants Ravenwood." "Smart man," Kane drawled. "Question is are you smart enough to make the right choice when he gets here? Hand over the woman, keep your ranch. Simple transaction." "Get out," Owen said quietly, "and all of you. Now." "Think about it, Everett," Reeves advised. "Is she worth losing everything you've built?" The sound of boots moving toward the door followed, then Kane's voice, lower but still audible. "Oh, and Everett, if you're thinking of running, don't. We've got men watching the roads. No one leaves Ravenwood without us knowing." The door closed. Footsteps crossed the porch. Horses neighed as their riders mounted up. Only when the sound of hoofbeats had faded into the distance did the trap door above Becca open, revealing Owen's grim face. "They're gone," he said, offering his hand to help her out. Becca emerged from the hiding place, limbs stiff from being confined in the small space. "They know I'm here," she said, stating the obvious. "And Victor is coming." Owen didn't reply immediately. He crossed to the window, looking out at the approaching storm clouds. "I need to check something," he said finally. "Stay here." He disappeared into his study, leaving Becca alone in the kitchen with her swirling thoughts. Victor coming to Silver Pine. The mortgage to Ravenwood now in his hands? It was no coincidence. Somehow he had discovered her whereabouts and was moving to corner her using Owen's ranch as leverage. Harold entered from the back door, stomping snow from his boots. His expression darkened at the sight of Becca standing alone in the kitchen. "I heard," he said bluntly, "Blackwood's coming, and he owns our mortgage now." "I'm sorry," Becca whispered. "This is my fault." Harold made a non-committal sound as he hung his coat on a peg. "Been waiting for something like this. Ranch hasn't been profitable for years, not since—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Since Margaret died," Becca ventured, seizing the rare opportunity to learn more. Harold's sharp eyes fixed on her. "You don't know anything about that, miss, and you'd be wise not to ask." "I'm living in her house, wearing her clothes, hiding in her room," Becca countered. "Don't you think I deserve to know something about her, about what happened to her?" The old man's weathered face seemed to age further as something like grief passed across his features. "She was my niece," he said quietly. "Did you know that my sister's girl came west to teach at the schoolhouse in Silverpine, met Mr. Everett at a town social?" A shadow crossed his face. "She was the light of this place for 2 years. Then one morning they found her at the bottom of Carter's Ridge. Fell, they said, or jumped." Becca's heart constricted. "Suicide." Harold's expression hardened. "That's what the inquest concluded. I never believed it. Margaret wasn't the type. She had too much faith, too much fight in her." He looked away. "But she'd been troubled those last few weeks, quiet, afraid even. I asked her what was wrong, but she wouldn't say. Just kept looking over her shoulder like she expected to find someone watching." "You think someone pushed her?" Becca could hardly voice the terrible suspicion. Harold's eyes met hers, filled with a grief that had hardened into something darker. "I think Margaret discovered something she wasn't supposed to know. Something about Emily. Emily Owen's first wife." Harold nodded grimly. "Died in a house fire 3 years before Margaret came to Ravenwood. Terrible accident, they said. Mr. Everett was the only survivor." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Before Becca could respond, Owen's voice came from the doorway. "Harold, that's enough." They both turned to find him standing there, his face a mask of controlled anger, a folder of papers clutched in his hand. "Sir, Harold began. "Leave us," Owen cut him off. "Now." The old man hesitated only briefly before departing, casting a final warning glance at Becca as he went. Owen crossed to the kitchen table and laid the folder down, opening it to reveal a stack of legal documents. "Kane was telling the truth," he said, his voice tight. "Blackwood acquired my mortgage 2 weeks ago. The bank never notified me of the transfer." 2 weeks, Becca repeated. "That's when I arrived here." "Yes." Owen met her gaze. "This isn't coincidence, Ms. Hayes. Your husband knew you were here almost from the beginning." A chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather ran through Becca. "How we were so careful." "I don't know, but it means we've been playing his game all along." Owen ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of frustration. "He's been letting us think we were safe while he positioned his pieces on the board." "Chess," Becca murmured. "Victor always thinks 10 moves ahead." "Well, his endgame is clear enough now," Owen said grimly. "He arrives tomorrow demanding both you and this ranch, and legally he has claim to both." The realization of what Victor had orchestrated settled over them like the approaching storm. Becca felt a familiar despair rising within her, the same helplessness that had defined her years of marriage. "What will you do?" she asked quietly. Owen was silent for a long moment, his blue eyes troubled as they met hers. "What would you have me do, Ms. Hayes?" The question caught her off guard. I, I don't understand." "It's simple enough," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I can surrender you to Blackwood and perhaps save my ranch. Or I can refuse and likely lose everything." He watched her face. "What would you ask of me?" Becca's throat tightened. It was a test, she realized. A test of her honesty, of her character. "I would never ask you to sacrifice your home for me," she said softly. "You've already risked too much on my behalf." Something shifted in Owen's expression, a softening perhaps, or a confirmation of something he'd suspected. "And if I chose to hand you over, what then?" "Then I would face whatever comes," Becca replied, lifting her chin slightly. "I've survived Victor once. I would find a way to do so again." Owen studied her for a long moment, as if searching for something in her eyes. Whatever he found seemed to satisfy him, for he nodded once decisively. "Pack whatever you need," he said. "We're leaving within the hour." Leaving, but Kane said they were watching the roads. "They're watching the roads," Owen agreed, "but not the old hunting trails through the eastern woods. Not in a storm like the one that's coming." Hope flickered to life within Becca. "Where would we go?" "I have a cabin," Owen explained, "a day's ride from here deep in the forest. A place I built years ago known only to Harold and myself. We can shelter there while we figure out our next move." "We," Becca echoed. "You're coming with me." Owen's expression was resolute. "I told you once that no one stood for me when I needed it most. I won't be that person for you, Ms. Hayes." He glanced at the mortgage papers on the table. "Besides, this ranch was likely lost the moment Blackwood acquired my debt. I'd rather lose it on my terms than his." Becca stared at him, overwhelmed by his willingness to sacrifice everything for her, a woman he barely knew, whom he had no reason to trust. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this?" Owen hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he said, "Because Harold was right about one thing. Margaret did discover something she wasn't supposed to know, but it wasn't what he thinks." He took a deep breath. "She found evidence that Victor Blackwood was responsible for my first wife's death." Becca's hand flew to her mouth. "What?" "Emily died in a fire that was ruled an accident." Owen explained, his voice tight with old pain. "But it wasn't. It was arson. Blackwood wanted our land, even back then, and it sits on a watershed that controls water rights to half the valley. When I refused to sell, the fire happened." His eyes darkened with remembered grief. "I was checking fence lines that night. Emily was alone. And Margaret discovered this," Owen nodded. "She was researching property transfers for the school board, found documents linking Blackwood to similar accidents across the territory." His expression grew haunted. "I begged her to let it go, told her it was too dangerous. But Margaret had a fierce sense of justice. She fell from Carter's Ridge," Becca said softly, piecing it together, "the night before she planned to take her evidence to the federal marshal in Helena." Owen's voice was hollow. "I found her body the next morning. By the time I returned home, our house had been searched, her documents stolen." "You think Victor had her killed?" "I know he did," Owen corrected, "but I couldn't prove it. No evidence, no witnesses, just the word of a grieving husband with a history of tragedy." His laugh was bitter. "The whispers started soon after. How strange that both my wives had met with fatal accidents. How fortunate that I was absent each time." Understanding dawned on Becca with sickening clarity. "They suspected you." "Many still do," Owen confirmed. "Harold chief among them, though he's stayed out of loyalty to Margaret's memory." He shook his head. "So you see, Ms. Hayes, your husband and I have unfinished business. This isn't just about you anymore." The revelation transformed everything Becca thought she knew about Owen Everett. Not a recluse by choice, but a man driven into isolation by suspicion and grief. Not a reluctant savior, but someone who recognized in her situation echoes of his own tragedy. "I'm so sorry," she said, the words entirely inadequate for the losses he had endured. "Don't be sorry," Owen replied. "Be ready. We leave in 30 minutes before the storm hits in full." He moved toward the door, then paused. "And Ms. Hayes, from now on, I think it's time we dispense with formalities. Call me Owen." A small gesture, but one that acknowledged the shift in their relationship from reluctant host and desperate fugitive to allies bound by a common enemy. "Owen," she tested the name. "Then you must call me Becca." He nodded, once the ghost of a smile touching his lips, before he departed to prepare for their journey. Becca stood alone in the kitchen, her mind reeling from all she had learned. Victor's reach was longer, his influence more pervasive than she had imagined. He had destroyed lives years before she had even met him, setting in motion a chain of tragedies that had ultimately led her to this moment, to this ranch, to Owen. There was a terrible symmetry to it, two people whose lives had been shattered by the same man, now fleeing together into an uncertain future. But as she hurried upstairs to gather her few possessions, Becca felt something beyond the fear and uncertainty that had been her constant companions since leaving Helena. Resolve, purpose, and beneath it all, a flicker of something dangerous and warm, a connection to Owen that transcended their shared enemy. The storm clouds gathered overhead as they made their final preparations. the wind picking up, carrying the first flakes of what promised to be a blizzard. Harold watched them with a mixture of disapproval and something less definable as they loaded provisions onto two sturdy mountain horses. "This is madness," he muttered to Owen, but his tone lacked its usual bite. He hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "I found something yesterday, in Margaret's old writing desk." Owen paused, his hands stilling on the saddle strap. "What letters?" Harold said, glancing toward Becca, who was busy securing supplies. "Correspondence between Margaret and Emily Wilcox's sister. She'd been investigating Blackwood longer than either of us knew." The old man's eyes, when they met Owen's, held a conflict that had been brewing for years. "Maybe I've been looking in the wrong direction all this time." Owen studied Harold's face, searching for the meaning behind this unexpected revelation. "Harold, I still don't know what to believe about Margaret," Harold cut him off. "But I know what she believed. And after reading those letters," he shook his head, "Blackwood is more dangerous than I thought." "We'll make it to the cabin," Owen said, his voice gentler than before. "Just make sure everything here looks normal. If anyone asks, tell them I've gone to Helena to speak with the bank about my mortgage." Harold's weathered face creased with concern, but there was something new there too, a determination that echoed Owen's own. "And what should I say when Blackwood himself arrives tomorrow?" "Tell him whatever you need to," Owen replied. "I don't expect loyalty that puts you in danger, old friend." The word friend seemed to surprise Harold, softening his expression briefly. "Be careful," he said gruffly. "Both of you." His gaze shifted to Becca, carrying more worry than suspicion for once. "Storm like this doesn't forgive mistakes." Becca nodded, touched by his concern. "Thank you for everything, Mr. Walsh." They set out as the snow began to fall, and Ernest, Owen leading the way toward a line of dark pines that marked the eastern boundary of Ravenwood. Becca followed closely, the horse beneath her, sure-footed, despite the deteriorating conditions. The wind rose as they entered the forest, howling through the branches overhead, though the thick pines offered some shelter from the worst of the storm. Owen navigated with the confidence of a man who knew these woods intimately, following trails visible only to his experienced eye. They rode in silence for the most part, conversation made difficult by the wind and the need to concentrate on the treacherous path. As daylight began to fade, the storm intensified, the temperature dropping precipitously with the approach of night. "We need to stop," Becca called over the wind's howl, her face inflamed by cold, despite the scarf wrapped around her head. "The horses can't go much further in this." Owen reined in his mount, turning in the saddle to look back at her. Snow had collected on his hat and shoulders, giving him a ghostly appearance in the gathering gloom. "There's a hunter's shelter half a mile ahead," he shouted back. "We can weather the worst of it there." The half-mile felt like 10 as they pressed on through deepening snow, the horses laboring with each step. By the time the small log structure appeared through the curtain of white darkness had nearly claimed the forest. The shelter was primitive, a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a narrow cot against one wall. But it offered walls against the wind and a roof against the snow, which by now was falling so heavily that the world beyond the doorway had disappeared into swirling white. Owen quickly set about starting a fire while Becca tended to the horses, securing them in the small lean-to attached to the shelter. By the time she returned, stamping snow from her boots, a small blaze had taken hold in the fireplace, casting flickering orange light across the cabin's interior. "It's not much," Owen observed as Becca moved gratefully toward the warmth, "but it'll keep us alive until morning." "It's perfect," she replied sincerely, holding her hands out to the flames. Though I'm beginning to think Harold was right about this journey being madness. Owen's mouth quirked in a half-smile as he hung his snow-covered coat on a peg by the door. Harold is often right. It's his most irritating quality. The small joke, unexpected from the usually serious man, startled a laugh from Becca. The sound seemed to surprise them both, a moment of normalcy in the midst of their desperate flight. Owen busied himself unpacking provisions, jerky hard biscuits, a flask of coffee, while Becca continued to thaw by the fire. Outside, the storm raged, rattling the shelter's single window and howling down the chimney like a living thing seeking entry. "Will we make it to your cabin tomorrow?" Becca asked, accepting a piece of jerky from Owen. He sat across from her, the firelight casting deep shadows across his face. "Depends on the storm. If it passes by morning, yes. If not," he shrugged, "we may need to stay here another day." The prospect of being confined in this small space with Owen sent an unexpected flutter through Becca's stomach. She attributed it to the stress of their situation and focused on her meager meal. "Tell me more about your cabin," she said, seeking neutral conversation. "You built it yourself." Owen nodded. "After Emily died, I needed somewhere else. Somewhere that didn't remind me of her." He stared into the fire, lost momentarily in memory. "It's remote, 10 miles from the nearest neighbor, but it's sturdy with good hunting and a clean spring nearby." "Sounds peaceful," Becca observed. Is. Owen's gaze lifted to meet hers. "I haven't been there since Margaret died. Couldn't bear to leave Ravenwood unattended with all the rumors circulating." The mention of Margaret brought Harold's suspicions back to Becca's mind. She hesitated, then ventured cautiously, "Owen, what Harold said about your wives. About the suspicions. Does it worry you?" he asked directly. "Being alone in the wilderness with a man some believe killed 2 women." Put so bluntly, the question should have frightened her. Instead, Becca found herself shaking her head. "No," she answered honestly. "I've lived with a true monster, Owen. I know what cruelty and violence look like up close." She met his gaze steadily. "I see grief in you and anger, but not the capacity for murder." Something shifted in Owen's expression, a tension releasing perhaps, or a wall lowering slightly. "Thank you for that," he said quietly. "Not many would be so trusting." "It's not trust," Becca corrected gently. "It's recognition. Survivors know each other." The word hung between them, survivors binding them with the shared experience of having endured what should have destroyed them. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the small space, the fire crackling between them, the storm raging outside. Then Owen cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "You should take the cot," he said, rising to check the horses. "I'll manage with my bedroll on the floor." When he returned, cheeks reddened from the brief exposure to the cold, Becca had arranged their limited bedding as comfortably as possible. The thin mattress for herself, Owen's bedroll laid out nearby, close enough to the fire to benefit from its warmth. "Thank you," he said, removing his boots before settling onto his makeshift bed. Becca did the same, though she kept her coat on against the chill that lingered despite the fire. As she lay down, the events of the day caught up with her. All at once, the confrontation at Ravenwood. The revelations about Owen's past, the harrowing journey through the storm. Exhaustion washed over her in a wave. "Owen," she said softly into the firelit darkness. "Yes." His voice came from nearby, equally quiet. "Do you think we'll ever be free of him, of Victor?" There was a long pause before Owen answered. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I intend to trust him." "So do I," Becca whispered, more to herself than to him. As sleep claimed her, Becca's last thought was that for all the danger they faced, for all the uncertainty that lay ahead, she felt safer in this primitive shelter with Owen than she had in years within her fine house in Helena. Outside, the storm continued to rage, wind and snow, laying a temporary blanket over their tracks, hiding 2 fugitives from the world that hunted them. Inside, the fire burned low, casting a warm glow over 2 people united by loss and a fragile newborn hope that perhaps together they might find justice. Or if not justice, then at least peace. And if peace remained elusive, then perhaps something else. Something neither of them dared name yet, but which had begun to take root in the boson soil of their wounded hearts. A chance to begin again. Dawn broke reluctantly over the snow-covered forest, the pale winter light filtering through clouds that had finally exhausted their burden during the night. The storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed world tree bent under heavy white cloaks, drifts piled shoulder-high against the hunter's shelter. A silence so profound it seemed to absorb all sound. Becca woke to find Owen already up, stoking the fire back to life from its overnight embers. His breath clouded in the cold air as he worked his movements, efficient and practiced. Outside, one of the horses nickered softly from the lean-to. "Morning," he said when he noticed her stirring. "Storm's passed." Becca sat up, pulling the blankets tighter around her shoulders against the morning chill. "How long until we reach your cabin?" 6 hours in this snow, maybe 7. Owen straightened, assessing her with those piercing blue eyes. "Think you can manage it?" Becca nodded, though her muscles ached from yesterday's ride. "I'll manage." They ate a sparse breakfast of the remaining jerky and biscuits, washing it down with coffee Owen brewed over the revived fire. Neither spoke much, each lost in private thoughts about what lay ahead. About Victor, who would even now be arriving in Silver Pine to find his prey vanished. About the future that had become as uncertain as the trail they would soon follow, through the snow-laden forest. As they prepared to leave, Becca found herself watching Owen, the careful way he checked their provisions, the gentleness with which he treated the horses, the alert vigilance that never seemed to leave him. In the span of a few weeks, this man had gone from stranger to reluctant host to ally, and now something more difficult to define. Something that made her heart quicken when their hands accidentally touched as they packed their meager belongings. "Ready?" Owen asked, holding the reins of her mount. Becca nodded, accepting his help to mount in the deep snow. The cold bit at her exposed skin as they set out, the horses laboring through drifts that sometimes reached their chests. Owen led the way, breaking trail with his larger gelding, occasionally reaching back to ensure Becca was still following. The forest was eerily beautiful after the storm. Pristine white draped over every branch, icicles hanging like crystal daggers from the pine sun, occasionally breaking through the clouds to transform the scene into a dazzling display of diamonds. Under different circumstances, Becca might have found it magical. Today she saw only the challenge it presented, the miles of difficult terrain between them and safety. They stopped at midday beside a frozen stream, allowing the horses to rest while they shared the last of the food from the hunter's shelter. "We're making good time," Owen observed, scanning the horizon with practiced eyes. "Another 4 hours, perhaps." Becca nodded, stamping her feet to restore circulation. "Will they follow us? Do you think Victor and his men—" "Eventually." Owen's expression was grim. "But the snow works in our favor. Our tracks will be difficult to follow, especially if more weather moves in." He glanced at the sky where clouds were again beginning to gather. "Which seems likely. And when we reach your cabin, what then?" Owen was quiet for a moment, as if weighing his answer. "I have supplies there. Weapons, enough to hold out through winter if necessary." He met her gaze directly. "And documents, copies of what Margaret found about Blackwood's land dealings and the fire that killed Emily." Becca's heart quickened. "You kept copies even after Margaret's papers were stolen." "She was smarter than Blackwood gave her credit for," Owen replied, a hint of pride in his voice. "Made duplicates of everything. Hid them at the cabin before she—" He looked away. "Before she died." "So we have evidence against Victor," Becca said, hope kindling within her. "Enough to take to the authorities." "Perhaps, if we can find someone who isn't in Blackwood's pocket." Owen's expression hardened. "Though I've come to believe justice in this territory isn't found through courts or sheriffs, not when money speaks louder than truth." The implication in his words sent a chill through Becca that had nothing to do with the cold. "What are you saying, Owen?" "I'm saying that sometimes Ms. Hayes, Becca, a man has to make his own justice." His eyes, when they met hers, contained a resolve that bordered on dangerous. "Blackwood has taken everything from both of us. Maybe it's time he understood what that feels like." Before Becca could respond, the distant crack of a rifle shot echoed through the trees. Both of them froze, eyes scanning the forest behind them. "Hunters," Becca whispered, though she already knew the answer. Owen shook his head, face grim. "No one hunts this deep in these conditions. Not unless they're tracking something specific." He moved quickly to the horses. "We need to move, now." They mounted hastily, abandoning their brief rest. Owen led them deeper into the forest, away from the trail they had been following, into thicker stands of pine where the snow lay shallower beneath the dense canopy. "Are they following our tracks?" Becca asked as they pushed through a particularly tight grove. "Probably," Owen replied without looking back. "But I know these woods better than any bounty hunter. There are ways to confuse the trail." He demonstrated this knowledge over the next hour, doubling back across their own path, leading them through shallow streams where water still ran beneath the ice, choosing routes that would be difficult to follow. All the while they listened for further gunshots, for voices, for any sign that their pursuers were closing in. None came, but the silence was almost worse than confirmation. It left them imagining threats behind every tree, within every shadow. By late afternoon, the light was already beginning to fade from the short winter day. Clouds had moved in, again bringing with them a light snow that dusted the previous day's accumulation. Becca's limbs ached with cold and fatigue, her mind dulled by the constant vigilance required to navigate the treacherous terrain. "There," Owen said, suddenly pointing ahead through a break in the trees. Becca followed his gesture and saw it, a small log cabin nestled against the face of a rocky outcropping, nearly invisible against the darkening forest. Smoke rose from its stone chimney, a thin gray plume against the clouded sky. Smoke! Becca's voice tightened with alarm. Someone's there. Owen's expression shifted from surprise to wariness. Harold, he said after a moment. It must be. No one else knows about this place. He studied the cabin for a long moment. Still, we approached carefully. They dismounted, leading the horses the final 100 yards through the trees, using the gathering darkness and scattered pines for cover. As they drew nearer, Becca could make out more details. A small porch, shuttered windows, a woodpile stacked neatly against one wall. It was a modest structure, but solid built to withstand the harsh Montana winters. Owen halted at the edge of the clearing, tying the horses to a low branch. From his saddlebag, he withdrew a revolver, checking that it was loaded before tucking it into his belt. Wait here, he instructed Becca. If anything happens, take the horses and ride east. You'll hit the main trail within a mile. Follow it north to reach Stillwater Creek. I'm not leaving you, Becca protested, but Owen silenced her with a sharp look. Just wait, he repeated more gently. If it's Harold, I'll signal. If not... He didn't finish the thought, but his hand rested meaningfully on the revolver. Becca watched anxiously as Owen moved forward, using the gathering darkness for cover as he approached the cabin. He circled wide, checking the perimeter before moving toward the front door, his footsteps silent in the fresh snow. At the door, he paused, listening. Then, with a sudden movement, he pushed it open, weapon drawn. Harold, his voice carried clearly in the still air. It's Everett. A moment of tense silence followed. Then, to Becca's immense relief, Owen lowered his gun and turned back toward the trees, waving for her to join him. She led the horses across the clearing, her heart still pounding from the tension of the moment. As she reached the porch, Harold appeared in the doorway behind Owen, his weathered face creased with worry. Took you long enough, the old man grumbled, though there was less hostility in his voice than Becca had grown accustomed to hearing. Been waiting since dawn. How did you get here ahead of us? Owen asked, surprise evident, as he helped Becca with the horses. Left right after you did, Harold replied. Took the North Pass. It's shorter if you know the way. He cast a critical eye over their exhausted state. Figured you'd need help, what with the storm and those men on your trail. Why? Owen asked directly, his gaze steady on the older man. The question contained years of tension, suspicion, and unspoken accusations. Harold's shoulders seemed to bear a new weight as he sighed. Those letters I found, Margaret kept copies of everything Everett, not just the documents about Blackwood's land deals. She kept a journal too. His voice grew rough with emotion. Said she was afraid something might happen to her, that Blackwood had threatened her. You never told me this, Owen said quietly, because I didn't want to believe it. Harold admitted, his weathered face showing the toll of his internal struggle. It was easier to... He stopped, unable to finish the thought. I've been a fool holding on to my suspicions when the real killer has been out there all this time, growing richer off others' misery. Becca watched the exchange with a growing understanding. This wasn't just about helping them now. This was Harold's attempt at atonement. So you came to help, she said softly. Harold nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a new respect. Margaret would have, and it's time I did right by her memory. What men? Becca asked sharply. Have you seen them? Harold nodded grimly. Passed a party of 4 about 3 miles back, following what they thought was your trail, led by that bounty hunter, Kane. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Course I might have mentioned seeing tracks heading toward Bear Creek when they asked. Owen clapped the older man on the shoulder, a rare gesture of affection. You old fox, you sent them into the wrong direction. Bought you some time at least, Harold acknowledged, but not much. Kane's no fool. He'll figure it out eventually. He stepped back from the door. Come inside. Fire's hot and there's stew. The cabin's interior was simple but comfortable. A main room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table and chairs, a small kitchen area, and 2 doors leading to what Becca assumed were bedrooms. The fire blazing in the hearth had warmed the space to a welcoming temperature, and the aroma of cooking food reminded her how little they had eaten that day. Harold served them bowls of venison stew while they thawed their frozen extremities by the fire. The hot food revived Becca's spirits somewhat, though anxiety still churned beneath her exhaustion. Blackwood arrived in Silver Pine this morning, Harold informed them as they ate. Caused quite a stir, arriving with 2 private guards and a federal marshal. Owen's head snapped up. A federal marshal from Helena. Harold nodded. Marshal James Donovan. Word is he's got arrest warrants for both of you. Theft and attempted murder for her. He nodded toward Becca, and harboring a fugitive for you. Donovan? Owen repeated, his expression darkening. He's in Blackwood's pocket. Has been for years. That's the rumor, Harold agreed. They're organizing search parties, offering $500 to any man who joins. The whole county will be looking for you by morning. Becca set down her spoon, appetite vanishing despite her hunger. We can't stay here, she said quietly. We need to keep moving. No, Owen countered. This is exactly where we need to be. He turned to Harold. Did you bring what I asked for from the false wall in my study? The old man nodded, rising to retrieve a saddlebag from near the door. Everything that was there, though I still think you are making a mistake, sir. These papers won't bring Margaret back. Or Emily. No, Owen agreed, taking the bag. But they might bring justice. He opened the bag, withdrawing a bundle of documents, deeds, letters, bank records, all carefully preserved. Spreading them on the table, he motioned for Becca to join him. These are Margaret's copies, he explained. Records of every suspicious land transfer in the territory over the past 5 years. Properties that changed hands after accidents, suicides, foreclosures, all eventually acquired by shell companies that trace back to Blackwood. Becca leafed through the papers, recognizing some of the transactions from her own discoveries at Victor's bank. This is extensive, she murmured. How did she find all this? Margaret was the school teacher, Owen replied, a note of pride in his voice. But she was also the town's unofficial historian. People trusted her with their records, their family histories. She saw patterns others missed. And this was why she died, Becca said softly. It wasn't a question. Owen nodded, his expression grim. The day before she fell, she told me she had conclusive proof linking Blackwood to Emily's death. A witness who saw him near our property the night of the fire. He picked up one of the documents. This man, Thomas Wilkins, he worked for the railroad back then, was camping near our property line while surveying for a new route. Where is he now? Becca asked. Dead, Harold interjected from across the room. Found floating in the Missouri River 2 days after Margaret's fall. Another accident. Silence fell over the cabin as the implications sank in. Victor's reach was longer, his methods more ruthless than even Becca had imagined. A man who would kill to build his empire, who would destroy lives without hesitation to satisfy his ambition. These documents alone won't be enough, Owen said finally. Not with Donovan involved. We need Blackwood himself to confess or to catch him in the act. How? Becca asked. Victor is too careful, too calculated. Owen's expression hardened into resolve. By giving him exactly what he wants. Us, here, trapped. You want to use us as bait? Becca realized, her voice barely above a whisper. I want to finish this, Owen corrected. Once and for all. Harold made a sound of disapproval from his position by the fire. This is madness. Blackwood won't come himself. He'll send his men, Kane, Donovan, the others. You'll be outnumbered, outgunned. Not if we plan carefully, Owen countered. He turned to Becca. But it has to be your choice too. You've already risked everything to escape him once. Becca studied the man before her, his face lined with determination and old grief. His blue eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. In the short time she had known Owen Everett, he had shown her more respect, more genuine concern for her well-being than Victor had in 5 years of marriage. And there was something else now, something unspoken, but growing between them, a connection forged in shared danger and mutual understanding. Something that in a different time, under different circumstances, might have been allowed to blossom into something profound. What's your plan? She asked simply. Owen's relief at her acceptance was visible in the slight relaxation of his shoulders. We make sure Blackwood knows where we are. We prepare the ground to our advantage. And when he comes, his voice hardened. We end his reign of terror in this territory. As darkness fell completely outside, they gathered around the table, planning their defense of the small cabin. Harold, despite his initial objections, proved invaluable, his knowledge of the surrounding terrain and his unexpected connections in Silver Pine giving them advantages they hadn't anticipated. Ben Cooper at the general store owes me a favor, the old man explained. He'll spread word that he saw tracks heading this way. By tomorrow, Blackwood will know exactly where to find you. Owen nodded approval. Good. That gives us tonight to prepare. He turned to Becca. Can you still shoot after yesterday's lesson? She nodded, remembering the feel of the rifle in her hands, the satisfaction of hitting her target. Yes, though I'm better with a rifle than a handgun. Perfect. Owen unrolled a rough map of the area surrounding the cabin. There's a ridge here about 300 yards from the cabin. Good sight lines to the main approach. I want you there with the Winchester. Becca studied the position he indicated, understanding dawning. You want me as a lookout? As a guardian angel, Owen corrected with the ghost of a smile. If things go wrong down here, you'll be our last line of defense. His expression grew serious again. And you'll have a clear shot at Blackwood if he shows himself. The implication was clear. Owen was giving her the opportunity to end Victor's threat permanently if necessary. The thought should have horrified her, but instead Becca felt a cold resolve settle in her chest. I understand, she said quietly. They continued planning late into the night, accounting for every contingency they could imagine. Harold would return to Silver Pine in the morning, ostensibly to join the search parties, but actually to feed them information about Blackwood's movements. Owen would prepare the cabin and surrounding area with various defenses and escape routes. Becca would familiarize herself with the ridge position and practice with the Winchester until she was confident of her aim at the required distance. It was well past midnight when they finally exhausted their preparations. Harold retreated to one of the small bedrooms, leaving Owen and Becca alone by the dying fire. For a long moment, neither spoke, the weight of what lay ahead heavy between them. You should rest, Owen said finally, his voice soft in the quiet room. Take the other bedroom. I'll keep watch. You need sleep too, Becca observed, noting the dark circles beneath his eyes. I'll manage. His attempt at a reassuring smile didn't quite reach his eyes. I've gone longer without rest. Becca hesitated, then reached across the space between them to touch his hand. Owen, she said softly, thank you for everything. He looked down at her hand on his, then turned his palm upward to clasp her fingers gently. Don't thank me yet, he replied. We're not safe, not by a long shot. I know, she acknowledged, but still, you've risked everything for me. A stranger. You're not a stranger anymore, Becca, Owen said, his voice low. His eyes, when they met hers, held something that made her heart quicken. You haven't been for some time. The intensity of his gaze, the warmth of his hand around hers, the unspoken meaning behind his words, all combined to create a moment of perfect stillness in the midst of their danger. For a heartbeat, Becca allowed herself to imagine a different future, one where they met under ordinary circumstances, where they could explore whatever was growing between them without the shadow of violence and pursuit. Then the moment began, reality reasserting itself with cruel efficiency. Owen gently released her hand, and Becca withdrew, the chill of the room suddenly more noticeable without his touch. Try to sleep, he said again, rising to add another log to the fire. Tomorrow will test us both. Becca nodded and retreated to the small bedroom, though sleep proved elusive despite her exhaustion. Her mind raced with thoughts of Victor, of the confrontation to come of Owen, and the way his hand had felt around hers. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were a confused tangle of pursuit and protection, of gunshots and gentle touches of danger, and something dangerously like hope. Morning arrived with a clear sky and bitter cold. Becca woke to the smell of coffee and the low murmur of voices from the main room. Dressing quickly in the chill air, she emerged to find Owen and Harold in intense discussion over the map. Morning, Owen greeted her, pouring a cup of coffee and passing it to her without being asked. Harold's about to head back to town. We were just finalizing details. The old man looked up, his weathered face solemn. Be careful, miss, he said with more warmth than he had previously shown her. These woods can be treacherous, especially for those who don't know them. Becca recognized the warning for what it was, not just about the physical dangers of the forest, but about the men who would soon be hunting them through it. Thank you, Mr. Walsh, for everything. Harold nodded once, gathered his few belongings, and with a final meaningful look at Owen, departed. They watched from the window as he mounted his horse and disappeared into the trees, heading back towards Silver Pine and the danger that waited there. He's a good man, Becca observed quietly, despite his suspicions about me. The best, Owen agreed. Stubborn as they come, but loyal to what matters. He turned from the window. We have work to do before they come. The day passed in focused activity. Owen showed Becca the ridge where she would position herself, helped her practice with the Winchester until she could reliably hit targets at the required distance, and explained the signals they would use to communicate once separated. One shot means they're coming, he instructed, as they walked back to the cabin in the afternoon light. Two in quick succession means Blackwood is with them. Three means you need help. And if I see you in danger, Becca asked, the possibility tightening her chest. Owen's expression was grim. Then you take whatever shot you need to. Don't hesitate. These men won't. At the cabin, Owen continued preparations, positioning extra weapons in strategic locations, setting up obstacles along the likely approach routes, preparing fallback positions if they were forced to retreat from the cabin itself. As dusk approached, bringing with it a drop in temperature that promised another bitter night, Owen finally called a halt to their preparations. We've done what we can, he said, setting aside the axe he'd been using to cut defensive stakes. Now we wait. They ate a simple dinner in relative silence, each lost in thoughts of the confrontation to come. After clearing away the few dishes, Owen checked and rechecked their weapons, a ritual that seemed to calm him. Becca watched him from her seat by the fire, noting the methodical precision of his movements, the focused intensity in his eyes. This was a man prepared for violence, she realized. Not eager for it, but ready, shaped by loss and injustice, into someone who would not be victimized again. Owen, she said softly, if something happens tomorrow, if things go wrong. He looked up from his task, his expression softening as he met her gaze. Don't think that way, he advised. Focus on what needs to be done, not what might go wrong. But there are things I need to say, Becca persisted. Things you should know. Owen set aside the revolver he'd been cleaning and moved to sit opposite her by the fire. I'm listening, he said simply. Becca took a deep breath, gathering her courage. If I don't survive tomorrow, you will, Owen interrupted, his voice firm. If I don't, she continued, holding his gaze. I want you to know that these past weeks, despite the danger, despite everything, they've meant something to me. You've meant something to me. The firelight played across Owen's features, softening the hard lines of his face, illuminating the surprise and something warmer in his eyes. Becca, he began, then stopped as if unsure how to continue. I haven't been. I know, she said gently. Neither have I, not for a long time. She reached across the space between them, taking his hand as she had the night before. But I think maybe in another life. Owen's fingers tightened around hers. Don't, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Don't talk as if this is an ending. We're going to survive tomorrow, both of us. And then what? Becca asked, the question escaping before she could consider it. For a long moment, Owen was silent, his eyes never leaving hers. And then, he said finally, we find out what's possible. Together. The promise in those simple words, the future they hinted at, filled Becca with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire beside them. For the first time since fleeing Helena, she allowed herself to fully imagine a life after Victor, not just survival, but living, building something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed. Owen's thumb traced a gentle pattern on the back of her hand, the small gesture conveying more than words could have. We should rest, he said eventually, though he made no move to release her hand. Tomorrow will come soon enough. When he finally did let go, it was with a reluctance that mirrored Becca's own. They moved around the cabin, securing doors and windows, banking the fire for the night, preparing for what morning would bring. At the door to her small bedroom, Becca paused, looking back at Owen. He stood by the main window, his silhouette outlined against the faint glow from the banked fire, a sentinel against the dangers that gathered in the darkness outside. Good night, Owen, she said softly. He turned, and even in the dim light, she could feel the intensity of his gaze. Good night, Becca, he replied. Sleep well. It was a simple exchange, ordinary words spoken on an extraordinary night. Yet as Becca closed her door and prepared for sleep, those words and all that had been left unspoken between them followed her into dreams that for once held more promise than fear. Dawn broke cold and clear, the rising sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered clearing around the cabin. Becca stood at the window of her small room, watching as the first light touched the tops of the pine and trees, transforming frost into momentary diamonds. A soft knock at her door preceded Owen's voice. Becca, it's time. She opened the door to find him fully dressed for the day ahead, rifle slung over his shoulder, revolver at his hip. His expression was calm, focused, all trace of the previous night's tenderness replaced by the determined resolve of a man preparing for battle. I'm ready, she assured him, though her racing heart suggested otherwise. They ate a hasty breakfast, going over their plan one final time. Becca would position herself on the ridge well before midday when Harold had predicted Blackwood's men would arrive. Owen would remain at the cabin, the obvious target, drawing their attention, while Becca provided oversight and, if necessary, protection from above. "Remember," Owen said as they prepared to part ways, "don't fire unless absolutely necessary. Once they know your position, you lose your advantage." Becca nodded, checking the Winchester one last time before slinging it over her shoulder. "Be careful," she said, unable to keep the concern from her voice. Owen's expression softened briefly. He reached out his gloved hand, gently touching her cheek in a gesture so unexpected it left Becca momentarily speechless. "You too," he said simply, then turned and walked back into the cabin, leaving Becca standing in the cold morning air, the ghost of his touch lingering on her skin. The climb to the ridge was arduous, the fresh snow making the steep path treacherous in places. By the time Becca reached the designated position, a natural depression behind a fallen log, partially screened by pine branches, the sun had risen fully above the horizon, casting its cold light across the landscape below. From her vantage point, she could see the entire clearing around the cabin, the main approach trail from the south, and even a portion of the path that led eventually back towards Silverpine. The Winchester's scope enhanced her view, allowing her to scan the distant trees for any sign of movement. For 2 hours she maintained her vigilance, shifting occasionally to keep her limbs from growing numb in the cold, never taking her eyes from the potential approaches for long. The forest remained still peaceful in its winter silence, betraying no hint of the violence that would soon disturb it. Just as Becca was beginning to wonder if Harold's information had been wrong, a movement at the edge of her vision caught her attention. Raising the rifle, she peered through the scope, focusing on the southern trail. Riders, 5 of them moving cautiously through the trees, their approach deliberate rather than hasty. Through the scope, she recognized Elias Kane at the lead, his distinctive duster visible even at this distance. Behind him rode Sheriff Reeves and 2 men she didn't recognize, hired guns, most likely their expressions hard even from afar. The 5th rider made her heart stutter in her chest. Victor Blackwood sat tall in his saddle, impeccably dressed, despite the wilderness surroundings, his silver-touched dark hair visible beneath a fine hat. Even at this distance, Becca could sense the confidence in his posture, the absolute certainty that had always characterized him. He rode slightly apart from the others, a king among servants, secure in his power and position. Taking careful aim, with trembling hands, Becca fired once into the air, the signal to Owen that they were coming. Then, after a moment's hesitation, a second shot. Blackwood is with them. The riders halted at the sound, heads turning toward the ridge where she was hidden. Kane raised a hand, directing 2 of the men to continue toward the cabin, while he, Reeves, and Blackwood remained at the edge of the clearing just within the tree line. Through the scope, Becca watched as the 2 men approached the cabin, cautiously, weapons drawn. Owen was nowhere to be seen, hidden inside, she presumed, waiting for the right moment to reveal himself. The men reached the porch, one covering, while the other kicked in the door. Becca tensed, finger hovering near the trigger, ready to provide support if needed. But no shot came from within the cabin. Instead, after a long moment, the men emerged, signaling back to their companions that the building was empty. Empty, cold dread washed over Becca. Where was Owen? Kane and Reeves spurred their horses forward, joining the men at the cabin. Victor remained behind, watching from the safety of the trees. Even at this distance, Becca could imagine his calculating expression, his mind working through the possibilities of their quarry's whereabouts. Movement to her left caught her attention, a flash of color against the white snow. Swinging the rifle in that direction, she saw Owen moving through the trees, circling around behind Victor's position. Understanding dawned. While the others were focused on the cabin, Owen intended to take Blackwood directly. It was bold, perhaps reckless, but potentially effective. Cut off the head, and the body would falter. Becca adjusted her position, keeping both the cabin and Owen's approach in her field of view as best she could. At the cabin, Kane had dismounted, examining something on the ground tracks, most likely leading away from the building. He gestured to the others, pointing in a direction that, with a sick feeling, Becca realized would intercept Owen's path. She had to warn him. Taking careful aim at a tree near Owen's position, she fired twice in rapid succession, danger approaching. The shots echoed across the clearing, startling birds from the trees and drawing the immediate attention of Kane and his men. Victor, still mounted at the edge of the clearing, suddenly spurred his horse forward, heading not toward the cabin, but directly toward the ridge where Becca was hidden. He had realized where the shots came from. He was coming for her. Panic gripped at Becca as she watched Victor's approach. She had lost sight of Owen in the confusion, couldn't tell if he had received her warning. Should she abandon her position? Make a run for the secondary location they had agreed upon. Before she could decide, another shot rang out, not from her rifle but from somewhere near the cabin. One of Kane's men fell clutching his shoulder. Owen had engaged. The clearing erupted into chaos. Kane and Reeves dove for cover, returning fire toward Owen's position among the trees. Victor, still on horseback, continued his determined approach toward the ridge, apparently confident that his men would handle the threat below. Becca swung the rifle back toward Victor, tracking his progress through the scope. He was still beyond effective pistol range, but closing quickly. She had a clear shot, clearer than she was likely to get again. Her finger tightened on the trigger, then hesitated. Could she do it? Could she take a human life, even one as destructive as Victor's? The moral question paralyzed her for a crucial moment. Then Victor raised his own weapon, a small, elegant revolver that gleamed in the winter sun, and fired in her direction. The bullet splintered wood from the fallen log that sheltered her, sending fragments flying past her face. Instinct took over. Becca squeezed the trigger. The Winchester bucked against her shoulder. Victor jerked in the saddle, his hat flying from his head. For a moment, he seemed to hang suspended in time, a look of genuine surprise replacing his usual controlled expression. Then he toppled sideways, falling heavily into the snow. His horse, startled by the sudden shift in weight, bolted back toward the trees. Becca stared through the scope, horrified and relieved in equal measure. Had she killed him? The thought brought no satisfaction, only a hollow feeling in the pit of her stomach. Then Victor moved, struggling to rise on one elbow. Her shot had grazed his head, a warning rather than a killing blow despite her clear opportunity. Even now, facing the man who had destroyed so many lives, Becca found she could not become what he was. Below in the clearing, the gunfight continued. Owen had worked his way closer to the cabin, using the prepared defensive positions to good advantage. Kane and Reeves were pinned down, unable to advance without exposing themselves to his fire. Becca turned her attention back to Victor, who had managed to get to his knees, one hand pressed to the bleeding gash along his temple. His revolver lay in the snow beside him, momentarily forgotten. Taking a deep breath, Becca emerged from her hiding place, rifle trained on Victor as she descended the slope toward him. He saw her coming, his eyes widening with recognition and something that might have been fear. "Rebecca," he called, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Stop this madness. You're making a terrible mistake." "The only mistake I made was marrying you," Becca replied, continuing her careful approach. "It's over, Victor. The documents, the witnesses, we have, everything. Your empire is finished." Victor's expression shifted, the momentary fear replaced by his usual confident smile. "Documents can be destroyed. Witnesses silenced. You of all people should know how this works, my dear." He nodded toward the ongoing gunfight. "Your champion is outnumbered. Even if he survives today, there will be others. I am not without resources." "Neither are we," Becca countered, though doubt began to creep into her resolve. Victor had always been persuasive, his logic seemingly irrefutable. "Come now, Rebecca." Victor continued, his voice taking on the reasonable tone that had once swayed her so effectively. "This has gone far enough. Return to Helena with me. I'm willing to forgive your indiscretion. We can put this unfortunate episode behind us." For a heartbeat, old patterns of thought threatened to reassert themselves, the ingrained habit of deferring to Victor's authority, of believing his version of reality over her own. Then a shot rang out from the clearing below, followed by a cry of pain. Becca glanced down to see Owen fall, clutching his leg, as Kane advanced on his position. "Owen!" she cried, momentarily distracted. It was all the opening Victor needed. He lunged for his revolver, raising it toward Becca with deadly intent. "You should have taken the kill shot when you had the chance," he snarled, all pretense of reasonableness gone. "I won't make the same mistake." Becca swung the Winchester back toward him, but she was too slow. Victor's finger tightened on the trigger. A shot echoed across the clearing, startling birds from the surrounding trees. Victor jerked backward, a look of profound surprise crossing his features. The revolver fell from his grasp as he looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest. Behind him, emerging from the trees, stood Harold Walsh, rifle still raised from the shot he had just fired. "That's for Margaret," the old man said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. Victor crumpled to his knees, then fell forward into the snow. This time he did not move again. Becca stared in shock, unable to process the sudden turn of events. Below in the clearing, the gunfire had ceased. Kane and Reeves, seeing their employer fall, had apparently decided discretion was the better part of valor. They were retreating, dragging their wounded companion with them. Owen, Becca gasped, remembering his fall. She hurried down the slope, half running, half sliding in her haste to reach him. She found him propped against a tree near the cabin, grimacing as he examined the wound in his thigh. Blood stained the snow around him, but the flow seemed to have slowed already. Just a graze, he assured her as she knelt beside him, hands already moving to examine the injury. Looks worse than it is. Becca's medical assessment confirmed his claim. The bullet had torn through flesh but missed bone and major vessels. A painful wound but not life-threatening if properly treated. Victor, Owen asked, his eyes searching her face. Dead, Becca replied, the reality of it still not fully registered in her mind. Harold shot him. Owen's surprise matched her own. Harold, footsteps crunched in the snow behind them. They turned to see the old man approaching, rifle slung over his shoulder, his weathered face solemn but resolute. Couldn't let him win, Harold explained simply. Not after everything, not after Margaret. A profound silence fell between them, heavy with the weight of years of misunderstanding and pain. Then Owen spoke, his voice low but clear. All this time, he said, you thought I was responsible. Harold's weathered face seemed to age and soften simultaneously. I needed someone to blame, he admitted. Someone I could see, could touch, easier than chasing shadows in powerful men. He looked toward Victor's body, then back to Owen. I was wrong about you, Everett. Have been for years. We both loved her, Owen said simply, in our own ways. Harold nodded, a sheen of moisture in his eyes that he would never acknowledge. She always said you were a good man. Should have trusted her judgment. He cleared his throat. Forgive an old fool. Owen extended his hand and Harold clasped it firmly, decades of suspicion and mistrust dissolving in that simple gesture, not just an alliance of convenience, but a true reconciliation built on shared grief and a common enemy finally defeated. What now? Becca asked, looking from one to the other. Kane and Reeves saw everything. They'll return with reinforcements. Let them, Harold replied with surprising confidence. Marshal Donovan won't be joining them. At their questioning looks, he continued. Found him passed out drunk at the Silver Dollar last night. Might have mentioned to the federal inspector who's been investigating corruption in the territory that his prized marshal was incapacitated while supposedly serving warrants. You old fox, Owen said with grudging admiration. You had this planned all along. Harold shrugged, though a hint of satisfaction shone in his eyes. Figured it was time to put things right. For Margaret, for Emily. His gaze shifted to Becca. For others who deserved better. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Becca tensed, raising the Winchester, but Harold placed a calming hand on her arm. That'll be Ben Cooper and Judge Wilson, he explained. I sent word after I left you yesterday. Figured we'd need witnesses of the right sort when this was over. Indeed, the riders who emerged from the trees were not Kane and his men, but a small group of townspeople from Silver Pine, the general store owner, the circuit judge, and several others Becca didn't recognize. Good God! Judge Wilson exclaimed as he dismounted, taking in the scene before him. Owen wounded Victor's body in the snow, the signs of the recent gun battle scattered around the clearing. What happened here? Justice, Your Honor, Harold replied simply. Long overdue justice. As the newcomers gathered around, Harold began to explain about Victor's land schemes, about Emily's murder, and Margaret's fall, about the documents that proved it all. The judge listened with growing consternation, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but never disputing the narrative. Becca, meanwhile, focused on tending to Owen's wound, cleaning and bandaging it as best she could with the limited supplies at hand. Their eyes met occasionally as she worked each contact, conveying what words couldn't in the midst of the surrounding activity. What happens now? She asked quietly, securing the final bandage. Owen's hand found hers warm despite the cold day. Now, he said softly, we find out what's possible. Together, just like I promised. The simple words echoing their conversation from the night before filled Becca with a warmth that spread outward from her core. Victor was gone. The threat had ended. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in her adult life, the future stretched before her unbounded by fear or constraint. Together, she agreed, her fingers tightening around Owen's. I think I'd like that. Around them, the business of justice continued statements, taken evidence, examined arrangements made for Victor's body to be transported back to Silverpine. But for Becca and Owen, seated together in the winter sunlight, these details were peripheral to the more important truth they had discovered amid the danger and loss, that sometimes from the ashes of destruction, new beginnings emerge, that healing is possible even from the deepest wounds, that hearts long guarded can learn to open again if only given reason to trust, and that on the vast Montana prairie where life was often harsh and justice sometimes delayed, hope could still take root and flourish as resilient and enduring as the land itself.